This is really exciting for me to be able to finally present a little bit of my dissertation research that's really in its early stages. I've experienced some delays like many of you, I'm sure, can relate with getting to the field and actually starting my dissertation research, but it looks like it's gonna start. And I'm here to present some of my preliminary findings, but also to get your feedback on my research plans. So like AJ said, I'm coming from the Department of Environmental and Global Health in the College of Public Health. And one of the goals that I have with my research that's on the relationships between people and plants and pathogens, speaking broadly, is to show that these relationships between people and plants change when disease ecologies change. And by studying these relationships, what I hope to do is demonstrate that the divisions that we place between human health and environmental health are not necessarily useful, and they can actually really limit a lot of what we understand about the environment and then also about human health as well. And they can also cause problems for what we see in terms of where risk is experienced when a health crisis occurs. So within this, one of my applied aims is to strengthen public health commitments to the area of conservation. Oftentimes, environmental scientists and ecologists and conservationists are arguing that their issues should be included in public health initiatives, but we rarely see those kinds of exchanges happening from the position of public health. So we have to frame environmental health issues as why they matter for human health. And what I hope to demonstrate through this research is that environmental health issues are important in and of themselves because they are so entwined and inseparable from human health crises. And really in that, I hope to kind of challenge that idea that any health crisis can really only be limited to humans. So I'll get started on talking about the Andean Wonder Drug, which is Cinchona officinalis. It is a species that's endemic to Ecuador, which is where my study is taking place. And Cinchona is known by many, many different names. So in addition to being called the Andean Wonder Drug because of its history as the natural source of quinine, and also the relative of synthetic pharmaceuticals like hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, which became very famous during the current pandemic. It's also known by many other names. So quina, the fever tree, cinchona, cascarilla, quina, Jesuit's bark, quinina, Peruvian bark, and cinchona. All of these names are really evidence of this plant's long history of interaction with people. That people from many different places and many different points in history had an influence in shaping what the tree is, and also using the tree in different ways. So as a commodity, as a natural resource, as a cultural artifact. So we see Cinchona's history of relationships with people in its many names, but the names that I'll primarily be using today are Cinchona, cascarilla, and quina. And I use these words for specific reasons. So cascarilla I use to refer to the bark of the tree itself, which is the main kind of natural medicinal product that comes from this tree. And I use quina to refer to the tree broadly speaking. So many, many different species that can fit into this designation. And then cinchona I use as a scientific term to refer to the genus Cinchona, into which fit many different species as well. So speaking of the medicinal uses of the Andean Wonder Drug, it's primarily extracted for its bark, specifically the bark from the trunk of the tree, though in some places, for different reasons, they might extract also the bark from lower branches. And in addition to using the bark, some people will also use the leaves and use the leaves in a tea, or may take pieces of the root and also use those for medicinal purposes as well. But the bark is important because it contains high concentrations of an alkaloid called quinine that has been distilled and used to make everything from tonic water that goes into gin and tonic to being synthesized into pharmaceutical products like hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. The traditional way of using the bark is by steeping it in an alcohol, a strong alcohol, either aguardiente or some other kind of strong alcohol, to make a tincture, and consuming it that way in a little shot. This is a picture taken by my father-in-law in Loja, who uses the bark that way. But also the bark can be dried and pulverized to varying degrees in a very fine powder or in chunks, and used to make tea mixed into different kinds of drinks and consumed that way. And the reason people consume cascarilla bark is to treat diseases that present with an intermittent fever. And what that means is a disease that your fever may spike and then it comes back down, and then it may spike again. And each one of these waves of fever can affect the body in different ways. Intermittent fevers can be very dangerous because of their tendency to exhaust the body. So one of these intermittent fevers that became extremely important to the history of Quina is malaria. So like I mentioned, my research takes place in Ecuador, and more specifically within the province of Loja, which is located in this southern region. And Loja is important to the history of Quina for many different reasons, but perhaps the two most important is because Loja is situated at the center of what ethnobiologists have called the axis of health. And the axis of health is basically a corridor where traditional ecological knowledge and biodiversity overlap. And the reason traditional ecological knowledge, and specifically knowledge of medicinal plants, is so rich in this region is because it sits at along the Andean corridor, along the Cordillera of the Andes. And anthropologists have found that along this mountain range, historically, indigenous communities were able to transfer very detailed and very extensive knowledge about medicinal plants, how to use them, and then also a very rich cosmology of how to understand and deal with health and illness. And we know this today because we see patterns of this cosmology in the present day, that not only among indigenous communities, but among communities that are descendant from communities with indigenous backgrounds, that there's a shared cosmology of how people think about and deal with illness. And this cosmology is sometimes thought about in terms of hot and cold. And it was very important, this kind of hot and cold distinction, in first identifying what Quina does for the body in terms of treating illness, and also which diseases it might be effective in treating. The second reason why Loja is considered within this axis of health and why the axis of health exists is because it's situated at the Andes-Andean confluence, the Andes-Amazonian confluence, where the Andes Mountains come in contact with the Amazonian rainforest. And in this area, many different microbiomes are possible and exist within a very small area. And this means that not only did indigenous communities have access to a massive network of knowledge sharing along the Andes Mountains, but they also had access to an extremely rich and biodiverse source of plant medicines. Loja is considered to be situated in one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. So the the health practitioners, the traditional health practitioners that lived in this area had extensive knowledge and also the resources available to them to practice health in a very extensive and skilled way. Now, the second reason I've chosen Loja as my primary field site is because it became extremely important in the history of extracting quina. And this begins in the early 17th century. And Loja became so important to the extraction of quina because in the 17th century, Spanish imperial interests led to several expeditions led by botanists and physicians to go to Loja, to go to Ecuador in this area along the axis of health to identify the best quina, which had been suggested as a potentially useful medicine for treating and dealing with malaria. At the time, malaria was seen as the primary barrier to deepening colonial presence in Latin America. So quina was definitely an object of interest to the Spanish crown. And the reason that Loja specifically became an area of extraction is because the combination of knowledge generated by these physicians and botanists and also pre-existing indigenous knowledge of the plant suggested that Loja is a place where the best quina is grown. So this first wave of extraction, like I mentioned, it happened in the 16th and in the 17th and 18th century, with probably the most extensive level of extraction happening between roughly 1718 to 1730. And like I mentioned, this first wave of extraction occurred because first, malaria was spreading rampantly, not only throughout Latin America, but it also was a pretty significant challenge within Europe itself. So because of the issue that malaria presented, Spain was very interested in just using cascarilla to control malaria. But on the other hand, particularly near the end of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire was very weak. They were also very poor. And so the fact that other European empires were also experiencing malaria as a threat and as an issue to quell in order to maintain control of their colonies, the Spanish Empire saw quina as a way of profiting from the natural resources in the New World. So that's why this first wave of extraction came about. And the outcome was the degradation of Ecuadorian forests, scarcity of cascarilla in its native home, but also a wave of bioprospecting. And this is really the era where we see bioprospecting emerging as a tool of imperial governance, where a resource from a colony is extracted and then implanted in another colonial context so that it can proliferate and be used as a commercial commodity. In the case of quina, once quina was seen as scarce in Ecuador itself, it was transported to other colonies, not just Spanish, but at this point, because the Spanish Empire was losing power, it came into the hands of the Dutch, the British, and also the French. And now we can see quina in large quantities, not in Ecuador, not in the axis of health where it's native to, but within former European colonies in Africa, and Southeast Asia. So what does this tell us about the relationship between people and plants today? It tells us that when diseases emerge, people will look to medicinal plants, which are often part of a repertoire of resources that local communities have for dealing with uncertain diseases. And that people look to these medicines to deal with crisis, to deal with fear of disease, and also they seek them out because of hope for a cure. And then these interests are also complicated by political and economic interests. And all of these interests combine to have impacts on the environment itself and on the potential survival of a species, really. And what my research is suggesting is that there is evidence that a second wave of extraction is upon us. And the reason this is important is because in the past, the rate of extracting quina was limited by technology at the time, just like the rate of generating knowledge about quina was limited by writing, handwritten letters, sending scientific publications that would take decades to reach their intended sources. So while the Spanish Empire and the rest of Europe was extremely interested in quina and definitely did succeed in extracting and degrading much of its native habitat, it took centuries for this kind of environmental degradation to manifest. Today, the evidence that we're seeing of a second wave is the kind of knowledge that's generated instantaneously, where knowledge is not only unreliable, that may be misinformation, but that it spreads through the population at a rate that could potentially lead to catastrophic environmental consequences for the tree. One piece of evidence that I have of this that I've demonstrated on this slide is this kind of call and response between media campaigns. When Donald Trump tweeted on March 21st that hydroxychloroquine was a potential cure for COVID-19, in Spanish, the word hydroxychloroquine sounds very similar to quina. And so these connections were made very early on between claims coming from the global north and from these conservative media outlets to potentially a way of dealing with COVID-19 that Ecuadorians had in their backyard. So maybe within 2 months or so, we get a response from both the public health and the conservation communities of these campaigns. One is La cascarilla no cura el coronavirus. Cascarilla does not cure coronavirus, or don't use, cascarilla doesn't protect you, use a mask. And these media responses and these campaigns were followed reports coming from conservative media, from social media about claims of cascarilla as a potential cure or treatment of COVID-19. So this is the evidence of a second wave. What we don't know is how the digital, this digital evidence of a second wave is actually taking place in physical environments. And that's what I hope to find out during my research. So because interest in cascarilla and also the ability to generate knowledge about cascarilla has shifted into these digital spaces today in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, my research is really centered on the idea of going viral, which I'll explain in a second. But my research asks how, why, and to what effects did cascarilla go viral during the COVID-19 pandemic? And I use this idea of going viral because I was inspired by a conceptual framework presented by Merit Ostabo in her recent book, Village Gone Viral, in 2021. Merit Ostabo is a faculty member at UF in the Center for African Studies, and she uses this concept to talk about how policies, particularly within the realm of development, tend to go viral when they generate a degree of kind of a contagious aspect to them. And I argued that this concept is useful for understanding conservation issues and public health issues as well. So I use going viral as an analytical concept to understand how the difference between the past context of the first wave of extraction and the present context of a potential second wave of extraction of quina are related and different. And then the second way I use the idea of going viral is to understand how cascarilla is moving. So moving in the sense of a material object as bark, powder, hills, trees, and also circulating in the way of through information. So through media campaigns, through social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook, and how this very rapid movement of information and materials that's made possible by today's digital world differently affects this plant in its habitat in Ecuador. So like I mentioned, I'm at the early stages of my dissertation research. I have begun the archival phase of my work, mostly by reading secondary data sources, local histories, also a history written by a North American author. But my hope is to get to both archives in Spain and in Ecuador to understand how patterns in trade and policy might be linked or might be indicative of patterns of extraction that were occurring in Ecuador when malaria emerged in Ecuador. So there have been previous histories of especially quinine, not so much of the quina tree itself, that have demonstrated the importance of quinine as an object of imperial interest. But what I hope to do is establish more of establish a stronger relationship between the importance of quina as a medicinal product that was used to respond to a disease threat, and the importance of that for the context of the tree's conservation status and the context of environmental degradation in the Andes. So to do that, I'll look at trade and policy documents, correspondences along those botanical and medicinal expeditions that I mentioned earlier, and also Jesuit records. And Jesuit records are particularly important, unfortunately, for understanding indigenous perspectives at the time. They're very skewed, they're often extremely racist, but Jesuits were impeccable record keepers. So much of the evidence that we have today about how indigenous communities used quina in as early as the 16th century are found in Jesuit records. The second phase of my research is predominantly ethnographic, and the digital ethnography of looking through social media, I've already begun because it's something I was able to do from the US, but I'll also be conducting an in-depth media analysis of looking at that call and response between social media and subsequent conservation and public health initiatives that emerged around quina in Ecuador and potentially beyond. I'll also conduct interviews with many different actors who are involved in generating knowledge about quina and also using quina for different reasons. So that will mean biomedical practitioners, but also traditional healthcare practitioners who are either indigenous or have indigenous backgrounds and are situated within that cosmology of the axis of health. And I'll also be conducting participant observation with community members as they go out and harvest cascarilla to better understand how the tree is being extracted, how people understand whether the extraction of cascarilla is intensifying in light of recent events. So my preliminary findings are that, yes, the relationship between quina and local people is again changing amid the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that public health and conservation institutions are responding to a perceived threat that's both related to the status of quina in its natural environment, but also to the potential issue that a significant body of knowledge indigenous knowledge has been eroding over many centuries of oppression in Ecuador. That means that the local population is no longer as knowledgeable as they may have been in the past about how to use quina, not within indigenous communities, but we see cascarilla use in non-indigenous communities today, in communities of practice that are not rooted in the traditional ecological knowledge of perhaps their ancestors, but also among European descendant and Mestizo descendant people. Another kind of initial finding that's coming out of my digital ethnography related to the idea of going viral is that going viral seems to be extremely useful as an epidemiological context to understand how information spreads, but it does not spread universally and without friction. And quina is understood in different ways among different populations because of issues of race and class that cannot be ignored. So while quina may be extracted and used very similarly to how it was in the past in indigenous communities or in communities that have links to that traditional ecological knowledge of the past, or is adapting traditional ecological knowledge to a present threat, other communities, particularly those with connections to conservative media and those considered higher class within Ecuador, may be using cascarilla in the form of its pharmaceutical relatives because of the connection between hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine in conservative media in the US. So as information is disseminated from conservative sources in the US, there is evidence of through statements made by conservative politicians in Ecuador that those same forms of quina are the ones that are viewed as the best quina today, not the quina from Loja, but the pharmaceutical quina that has been developed by European and North American scientists. And what I hope to find out is, what does going viral mean for this plant today? My suspicion is that because environments in and around Loja were already highly degraded and deforested, that this new wave of extraction that is complicated by the rapid spread of information about quina could have even more severe consequences for the tree today. That said, this tree is also subject to a very complex taxonomical history, which leads me to think what we know about the conservation status of quina today is very ambiguous. Is it as endangered as it seems to be according to local sources? It is not listed on the IUCN Red List. And what I hope to link this to is that how we think about nature as a as an endangered species or as not, and the way we generate knowledge about nature changes what we know about how it relates to people. And ultimately, what I hope to do with this is demonstrate that what we know about quina is ambiguous and constantly changing, and it may change even more rapidly when human disease crises take place. And that is all I have for you today. So thank you for listening. And I think now I'll open it up for questions and feedback.